we've talked about the building blocks, our neurons, and how those make up the nervous system. We've looked at how neurons communicate. We have action potentials within a nerve, or within a neuron, and how we can communicate chemically between neurons. Now we're going to start putting it together. We're going to take a step back and start looking at our nervous system as a whole. So we're going to get into a little bit of anatomy type stuff here as we start talking about the different subsections of our nervous system and what each of those sections do. So we're going to start with the 3 broad categories of neurons. And these are going to make up all different parts of our nervous system. So our sensory neurons are going to be carrying input messages from the sense organs to the spinal cord and brain. So our spinal cord and brain, we'll get to it in a few slides, that's our central nervous system. That's where all of our sort of information processing is going to be happening. And so these sensory neurons are going to take things that we are perceiving from our environment, and it's going to pass that information along to our spinal cord and our brain to process that information and decide what to do with it. So this sensory information could be something like a temperature sensor. It could be what you're seeing with your eyes. It could be what you're hearing. That's all sensory information. And so these sensory neurons are going to bring that sensory information, taking information about our environment and bringing it into our body. To go the other way, we have motor neurons, and these are going to transmit output impulses from our brain and spinal cord out to our muscles and organs. So this is how we move our hand when we think about moving our hand. The motor neurons allow the thought from our brain, that command to reach for something, it allows it to travel to the muscles that are in our arm and our hand to do that movement. So sensory neurons are an input, they're bringing in information from the environment, and motor neurons are an output, where our brain is sending messages outward to act on our muscles or organs to do something. And in the middle, we have our third type, and these are our interneurons. These are the ones that are neither sensory nor motor neurons, but tend to exist between the two. So they're going to perform connective or associative functions within our nervous system. So they can connect a sensory neuron to a motor neuron to allow the input to output cycle to finish. And interneurons are going to be the most common type of neuron within our bodies. And a good way to think about, well, what does an interneuron do? An interneuron would be involved in helping us recognize a song. So to recognize a song, you have to hear that song. So your sensory neurons are bringing in a signal from your ear saying, hey, this is what you're hearing right now. Your interneurons can then compare what you're hearing right now to things that you have stored in your memory. What's in your brain stored away for songs that you've heard in the past. And when you make that association, you can use the interneurons to make that connection. And we can actually see a map showing our sensory incoming neurons doing something with an interneuron and then sending out a signal using our motor neurons here. And this is an illustration that's meant to show a reflex arc. So we'll come back and talk about the specifics of that a little bit later this chapter. But if we're looking here, so we have, looking at the blue signal here first, we have skin receptors. So they're going to be picking up on temperature. And so those sensory receptors in our skin will pass information along to a sensory neuron, which is this blue line here. And this sensory neuron will bring the information into the body from the environment and bring it into here, in this case, our spinal cord. And our spinal cord is going to have a bunch of interneurons that allow us to evaluate things, compare things. Maybe we're going to send a signal up to the brain to let the brain know that our finger is feeling something that's too hot. Or as we're looking at a reflex arc, you can also have special cases where you react to something without your brain being involved. So it's almost like a special case where our spinal cord is making a decision for us. And it's the interneurons, this connection, that's going to do that decision making here. And so this interneuron takes that sensory information that's coming in, evaluates it, and creates this reaction, this muscle response using our motor neurons, sending out a signal that's telling us to contract the muscles in our hand and pull our hand away from the fire. So we have the sensory neuron input, the interneuron evaluation, and then the motor neuron response. And that 3-step process is usually what's going on, at least at the most basic level. And so now we're going to start looking at all of the different parts of our nervous system. Now, this diagram here is a little bit much because this is showing us the whole overview for all of the parts of our nervous system that we're going to talk about. And in fact, we're going to break this down into much smaller, more manageable pieces. So we're not memorizing all of this stuff all at once. What we're going to do is break it down into small pieces first. And it's easier for us to start with our peripheral nervous system, the PNS. So we're only going to look at this green side for now, and we'll start looking at our central nervous system, the CNS, a little bit later on. So if we only focus in on our peripheral nervous system, we can see that it's made up of 2 major categories. We have a somatic system and an autonomic system. And each of these are going to get their own slide where we can talk about the specifics relating to each part. And then we're going to break our autonomic system down into sympathetic and parasympathetic, but we'll get to that. So for our somatic nervous system, when we're looking at, looking at this side here, we're specifying voluntary action, but we'll get to that. Our somatic nervous system is going to be made up of mostly sensory and motor neurons. And they're going to group together so you can have a collection of multiple sensory neurons or multiple motor neurons. And they're going to form together into bundles called nerves. And because it's a science and people like to name things in really annoying ways, inside the brain, if we're talking about nerves, we're actually going to call them tracts. They're the exact same thing. They're still bundles of sensory or motor neurons, but once they're in the brain, you call them a tract. But if we're outside of the brain, when we're in our somatic nervous system, we're going to call them nerves, and that's just a collection of our neurons. And our somatic nervous system is going to bring information from our sensory receptors, so bringing it in and sending information out to our muscles. And so because it's involving our muscles, this part of our nervous system is going to be involved in when we're making voluntary movements. So if you choose to contract the muscles in your hand, if you choose to move your hand, you are making a voluntary movement. And that's what this part of our nervous system is involved in. But the next part, our autonomic nervous system, is actually involved in the things that are happening automatically. So I always say the autonomic parts are automatic. And it's annoying, but it will stick in your brain and it will help you on a test. So our autonomic nervous system is involved in regulating our internal environment. So this is running all of the stuff that's happening internally that we're not necessarily aware of. So these are our involuntary or automatic functions like breathing, our circulation of blood, digesting food. anything that's happening in the background within our bodies is usually regulated by our autonomic nervous system. So this is going to involve aspects of motivation, our emotional behavior, and specifically our stress responses. So we'll talk a lot about stress responses in just a minute. And as we saw on our breakdown of the different parts of our nervous system, our autonomic nervous system has two major components, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And we can see these here. So our autonomic system is all of our involuntary stuff. So smooth muscle means the stuff involved in digestion. Cardiac muscle is having our heart beat. Glands are things that are emitting our hormones and chemicals, stuff that's happening without our say-so. And this is going to be our sympathetic and parasympathetic are those two sections of the autonomic nervous system. And so our sympathetic nervous system is mostly involved in activation or physiological arousal. And so this is going to be working you up. So you have more energy, you're going to be more active. And this activation tends to happen as a whole unit. So the whole body becomes activated in response to something. And our sympathetic nervous system is most well known for its involvement in our fight or flight response. So you might have heard of the fight or flight response as if you are faced with a threat, your body usually has two possible options. And my go-to example for fight or flight is that you turn around and there's a bear. And so you have the option of, do you fight that bear? Do you punch it in the nose and hope to scare it off? Or do you turn around and run away? What is the best option for your survival? And in both cases, to try and deal with either fighting something off or running away, you're going to need lots of energy. You're facing a startling situation and you have to have energy to deal with it. You need a faster heart rate. You need more blood flow. You need more oxygen in your lungs and you need to be ready to move. So you are activated and ready for a fight or to flee. Our parasympathetic nervous system is actually going to do the opposite. They're going to act as a pair. One is going to activate and the other not necessarily deactivates, but slows everything down. So our parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow down our body processes. It's going to return us to a state of rest after we've been in a fight or flight situation. And instead of activating the whole body at once, the parasympathetic nervous system tends to slow down individual pieces sort of one at a time. So it would act to slow your heart down to counteract your sympathetic nervous system causing that increase in heart rate. It would slow your breathing to counteract what the sympathetic nervous system had done. So it's going to operate sort of one system at a time to try and bring everything back to normal. And so if our sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight response, the parasympathetic nervous system is sometimes called the feed and breed system. So this is what allows you to live sort of normal everyday life, where you go through the tasks of finding food, living a normal life, and maybe having offspring. That being said, as much as the textbook tells us that, it's for the feed and breed system, I had never really heard that term before this course. So don't feel bad if you don't know what it is, because I definitely didn't. And so with our one system is activating and the other system is bringing everything back to normal, these two sides of the coin can actually work together to maintain balance within our body. And this balance is what we call homeostasis. And homeostasis is going to be one of those topics that comes up all throughout this course. And so homeostasis is going to be a delicate balance maintaining some kind of common or constant internal state. So when we talk about normal human body temperature, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system will act together to maintain that normal body temperature. Your sympathetic system, as it increases arousal, might actually raise your body temperature, but the parasympathetic system will try and bring that temperature back down again so that you maintain that homeostatic balance, so that you have a normal range. And it isn't just body temperature, that's just one of the easiest to think about. You can also have homeostasis in terms of your blood pH or concentrations of different nutrients within the body. All of these things can have homeostasis if there is a normal, ideal level that they should exist at for your everyday life. And homeostasis is maintaining that normal level. And for those who are visual learners, we can look at the difference in effects for our parasympathetic and our sympathetic nervous system. And I'll start with sympathetic because that's what we talked about first in our slides. So for our sympathetic nervous system, we would dilate our pupils because you're enhancing vision because you're facing a threat. You need to see better to evaluate that threat. Your bronchi will relax, and that's going to increase the flow of air into your lungs, which gives you more oxygen to have more oxygen available as you burn energy. We can accelerate and strengthen the heartbeat, again, to increase the availability of oxygen to other parts of your body. And the sympathetic system also does something interesting where it inhibits activity in some of our internal organs, so specifically our digestive tract. So it doesn't just activate, it inhibits our digestive tract specifically because it wants to increase the availability of blood to other parts of our body. But that is one where it isn't increasing activity there, it's inhibiting or decreasing activity so it can increase something else elsewhere. And then we can also contract our blood vessels to try and increase our blood pressure, to let that oxygen circulate throughout the body faster. And then we can look at the exact opposite, where our parasympathetic contracts our pupils, constricts our bronchi, it slows our heartbeat, it resumes our digestive activity, and it's going to redilate our vessels. So they're acting in exact opposites to each other, and overall, we should have some kind of balance where our pupils are at normal dilation. We're getting the normal amount of oxygen through our lungs, and so on and so forth. So now that we've done the green side of our chart, the green side of our nervous system, we're going to move on and talk about the purple side, our central nervous system. And we're going to start with the most basic breakdown, which is that our central nervous system is made up of our brain and our spinal cord. And then it gets more complicated down from there as we start talking about all of the different parts of the brain and what each of those parts do. But let's start at the beginning. And so our spinal cord is the cord of nerves that runs up our spine. This is what connects our peripheral nervous system, all the stuff we talked about that was on the green side of the chart. This connects all of those pieces with the brain. And so nerves will enter and leave the central nervous system through the spinal cord. And as always, there's a caveat here. So almost all nerves enter and leave the central nervous system by our spinal cord, meaning that most of our sensory neurons coming in and the motor neurons going out, most of those travel through our spinal cord. And so the spinal cord is a connection between the brain and everything else. But there are a couple of places that actually skip the spinal cord. And I just mention these because, again, I think the exceptions are kind of cool. So it's not on the slide, but there are some nerves in our face, so specifically connecting to our facial expressions and how we move our face and stuff like that. And those connect directly into the base of our brain instead of going through the spinal cord first. So if anyone ever asks you, for who knows why, if anyone ever asks you if all nerves use the spinal cord to enter and exit, you can say no, there are some exceptions. And for the physical details of our spinal cord, it tends to be between 40 and 45 centimeters long. Depends on the dimensions of your torso. And it tends to be about 2.5 centimeters wide. So it is really that big of a structure, considering all that it does with routing everything through our bodies. And so now we're actually going to bounce back and talk about those spinal reflexes in just a smidge more detail. So spinal reflexes, or a reflex arc, you may have seen them called in another class, these are going to be simple stimulus response sequences. So stimulus meaning that you are sensing something using those sensory receptors outside of the body, and response meaning that you're going to do something because of the stimulus. You're going to respond to that stimulus. And our motor neurons do the responding because they're signaling a muscle to do some kind of reaction, at least in this case. And we kind of mentioned already that these spinal reflexes are actually triggered at the level of the spinal cord. So the interneurons within the spinal cord will do the quote-unquote decision-making and decide if you should respond to a particular stimulus. And I'm using verbal theoretical air quotes here because to say that you are deciding something usually implies some kind of conscious thought. So we're kind of humanizing what's happening at the level of the spinal cord, but it's more of the interneuron is weighting those options and does what it's supposed to do, where it will make or trigger that motor response if the stimulus that it's detecting is intense enough to warrant that response. But what we care about is that it's really cool that this happens because this action, this reaction to a stimulus, happens without any brain involvement. And so we can come back to this image here where we were looking at somebody putting their hand too close to a candle, and this sensory neuron is bringing in that information that's letting us know that our hand is feeling pain because the heat is too intense. And this interneuron will evaluate that intensity of a stimulus, and because it's intense enough, it will trigger a response where the muscle will contract and pull our hand back from the thing that's causing the source of pain. And when we say it's happening without brain involvement, I'm not saying that your brain doesn't know that it happened. I'm saying that to save the extra time that it would take for a signal to travel up your spinal cord and into your brain to the part of the brain that could make a conscious decision about this instance, that decision, again in quotes, is triggered at the spinal cord level so that it can happen faster. And these interneurons will also pass that information on to the brain that basically lets it know that, yes, we felt something that was too intense and we triggered a response to stop that feeling. So your brain isn't completely out of the loop. The pathway just splits a little bit so that those interneurons can let the brain know what's going on. And these reflexes are just very cool. So bring them up at this point. All right, so that was the spinal cord. Next, we're going to start talking about the brain. And the brain can be broken down into lots of different pieces, and we can talk about all sorts of aspects of it. And a lot of these, again, are going to come up over and over again as we start talking about different parts of our behavior. So it's a good idea to learn them early because they're going to keep coming up. We're going to keep discussing them as time goes on. And so if we want to do our basics of the brain tends to be around 1.4 kilograms. And it's mostly protein and fat and some fluid. And people consider our brain as the real you. So that is where your consciousness is located. And this is a very complex structure. It demands huge amounts of resources. So most of the oxygen that we take in gets routed to our brains. Most of our blood flow goes through the brain. It's taking up lots of the energy that we need to survive. The brain just hogs all of our resources. And this is a slide that is here just for your information, because we're going to be looking at lots of different images of the brain. And I've had students in the past who ask why the brain doesn't always look exactly the same. And the reason why different images will look different is because you can actually look at the brain in different directions. So in this case, we're going to talk about different planes of the brain. So we can have this orange one, which is a horizontal cut through the brain. And these are named after the way that we used to most commonly look at the brain, where you would take the brain of a deceased person or animal, and you could slice it to look at those slices and see what's going on structurally. Nowadays, we can use these theoretical cuts using a lot of our brain imaging systems, which, again, we'll talk about later in this chapter. But we can have a cut that goes horizontally through our brain. So from the front to the back, kind of level across the top of your ears, that would be a horizontal slice. And it's going to give you sort of an image as if you were looking down on the brain. So you would see it kind of flat, as if you were looking down from the top of that person's head. And this is a lot easier to do in person, but hopefully it makes sense. The next one that you'll sometimes see is called a coronal plane. And this is when you're looking at the person basically from the front, or I suppose from the back, and you're slicing vertically through their head, again, keeping it level with their ears, but this time slicing up and down instead of side to side. And that will give you this coronal image, and you can see the two hemispheres and then all the middle structures. One of the more common ones that we're going to see is a sagittal plane, and that's where you basically look at someone from the side. So if you're facing their ear and sliced across their brain that way, and so you can see the front of their head and the back of their head, and this is a sagittal plane. And I tell you this again, not because I'm going to test you on these planes, but because we're going to see lots and lots of brains cut in different ways, and I want you to know what it is that we're looking at in each of those cases. And so before we get into the specific sections of the brain and what each part does, I want to take a little bit of a detour and start talking about how we actually know what each of those parts of the brain does. So I want to talk about how we can study the brain, or how we have studied the brain. And we can talk about a couple of very basic methods here. So the first are post-mortem studies, which I've already kind of mentioned, in that we used to most commonly look at the brain by having a dead human or other kind of animal. You could remove the brain, slice that brain, and look at the gross structures. You could see the overall picture, which we have listed right here. So you can see overall structures, any malformations. So if you could look at somebody's brain and see that they had damage to a particular part of that brain, if you knew anything about that person before they died, maybe you noticed that they had trouble remembering numbers. And so you could make an assumption that the damage that you're seeing on their brain might have been responsible for their problems with numbers. So you could make some associations by studying someone before their death and then looking for any problems in their brain afterwards. And so you can make some connections and some basic assumptions that way. And that used to be one of the most common ways of doing this because they didn't have any of the other techniques that we can use nowadays. The next kind of study is a live study. And in this case, we'd be looking first at live studies in non-human animals. And so some of these methods will include in vivo research. So you could work in a living animal. Maybe you'd want to record a single cell in the brain. You want to look at if this neuron is firing at any particular point in time. You might use a lesion study where you could cause damage to a particular part of the brain and see how the behavior changes. Or you could go really futuristic sounding and you could use genetic manipulation. Maybe you could breed mice that produce an excess of a certain neurotransmitter in certain parts of their brain and see what happens. So these are lots of ways that you can sort of manipulate what's going on and see how that changes behavior. And then the next section is doing these live studies, but in humans. And so it's really hard to get ethical approval, as you can imagine, to do any of these kinds of work, because anything involving the brain is pretty risky. So in order to do this kind of research in humans, you have to have a pretty good reason to do it. And some of the ways you can get around this is if you're damaging part of the brain specifically to give some kind of benefit to the patient. So in some really weird cases, you can have people with epilepsy will opt to have part of their brain damaged to try and help stop their epileptic seizures. In older times, people used to conduct prefrontal lobotomies where they would damage the frontal lobe of their brain to try and get rid of bad behaviors. But as you can imagine, there are some side effects with damaging parts of the brain. And we'll talk about some of those side effects later on in the course when we get into some of our case studies. And I'm actually going to leave it there because the next series of live study discussions are going to be brain imaging, and I'd rather do those all in one go.